Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of Intro to Political Theory. Hope everybody had a good Labor Day. It was nice to have a bit of a long weekend to get us sort of going in the semester. So I bet you guys didn't realize when you watched 300 that the Spartans were a bunch of commies, right? It's not exactly the not exactly the picture we think of when, at least for me, when I think about the Spartans as being socialists or communists. But a lot of you commented in the discussions that there were some very strong socialists, very strong communists, and even some uh, utopian ideas that were put forward by Lycurgus when he was designing the form of government in Sparta. Somebody even referred to the Spartans as liberal, which I thought was really interesting, but the student was thinking about liberal sort of in the progressive sense, right, that we think about liberals like Democrats or something today, right? So interesting to hear what you guys thought about the Spartans, and I think it was pretty much unanimous. There were a few people who said they would like to live in Sparta, but for the most part, people were like, "Nah, I think I'm good where I am." So anyway, no real announcements this week. I thought you guys did a good job in the discussions. Just make sure that you're responding, in a timely manner. Remember the first post is due within the first 24 hours, and then the next one is due by Sunday at 5. So good job on the discussions. There's no quiz this week. So I thought I would talk a little bit about Lycurgus, right, and why Lycurgus is important. So Lycurgus is generally thought of to be one of the first people to actually put a constitutional government into place, right? So Lycurgus had this notion of what a government should be, how a government should work, right? And we ask ourselves, well, how did Lycurgus come up with that idea? Well, of course, he traveled around, right? So he went to Crete, and there he met Thales, who was a poet, and he was a philosopher as well. And he talked about, the importance of tranquility in society, equality in society, and Lycurgus, really got on board with a lot of the ideas that Thales had put into place, or that Thales was espousing. So that's sort of where that notion of equality that we see Lycurgus try to put into place came from. He also traveled to Turkey, which in what we read was referred to as Asia, right? Asia Minor. And there, in Asia, is when he became introduced to sort of the poems of Homer, right? So we know Homer through the Iliad and the Odyssey, talking about the Trojan War, and in the Odyssey, Odysseus travels home from Troy back to Greece. And from Homer, he picked up this notion of sort of military discipline, right? Military discipline and politics, especially seen, among like Odysseus and Agamemnon and things like that. And finally, well, he went several other places, reportedly, but Egypt, right, was another one of the places where they claimed that Lycurgus went. And in Egypt is where Lycurgus sort of got this idea of separating the military from the rest of society, and also this notion of sort of separating the craftsmen themselves, kind of taking commerce in a sense out of the realm of politics. But then they say that Lycurgus traveled all over. Some people say he went to Libya. Some people say he went to India. So Lycurgus, when there was some flack at home, right, from him pissing off the Queen Mother, right, Lycurgus decided to flee and travel around. And in traveling, he noticed all these interesting political, devices that certain countries were using, and he sort of picked and chose from those to try to set up this sort of perfect notion of what he thought would be a great government, right? So eventually, they called Lycurgus back to Sparta, and they sort of begged him to take control of the polis. And he said he would, but first he needed to go consult the oracle at Delphi, right? Apollo's oracle. And while he was there, she told him that he was favored by the gods, right? And he was even a god amongst men, right? So here we get another notion, and this was important certainly in ancient Greece having sort of this divine license, right? That's where, in a lot of ways, that's where Lycurgus's legitimate authority actually came from, was from Apollo and his oracle, right, at Delphi, who gave him sort of the legitimacy to rule and to institute this form of government in Sparta. So Lycurgus goes back to Sparta after he receives the great news from the oracle, which of course was not necessarily written down, right? So we're kind of going on what Lycurgus is telling us here. But he goes back and he gets together 30 of his staunchest allies, right? And he's trying to get them on board to make sure that he can sort of put all these policies into place that he's learned and thought of throughout the years. So he gets back, right, and he gets all these people on board, and he even eventually gets the king on board, and he's essentially put into this position of being the person who, sort of the lawgiver, right, of Sparta, the one that's going to shape Spartan society. So one thing that's important to think about when you're thinking about Lycurgus and Sparta, and whether you want to live there or not is, it's not inconsequential, but it's worth thinking about the ends of government or the virtues that Lycurgus thought that a government should protect and should set up in a society, right? So for Lycurgus, we had equality, right? That was the number one thing that he was trying to set up, was equality. As a matter of fact, the Spartans' names for themselves were the Homoi, right? So Homo, Oioi, right? And homo means the same, right, in ancient Greek. So he was talking of the Homoi. The Spartans called themselves the equals. That was essentially their names. So equality was the sort of the chief virtue that Lycurgus put into place in Sparta. Secondly was this notion of military prowess, right? And that was important because of this notion of the Spartans having these slaves surrounding them, right? The helots. The helots far outnumbered the Homoi, right? So in order to make sure that they could control the slave population that they had, of all the places they had conquered, essentially, they made all the people that they conquered their slaves, right? So in order to keep these slaves in check, they had to have a very strong military to actually make sure that the slaves didn't revolt and overthrow them. And then the final thing was this notion of austerity, right? That he wasn't interested in, people could only use an axe, right? An axe and a hammer to build a house, right? They weren't allowed to use sort of individual tools that could make their own individual expressions, right? He didn't want people eating fancy food, right? He banished all the arts, all the sort of painting and all the superfluous arts, he called them, right? These forms of individual expression, right? And it's an interesting question as to why Lycurgus did that. I mean, he made arguments as far as the food goes, so that they would stay healthy, right? And with this notion of individual expression, living in a fancy house that had been designed and has all these nice paintings, he thought that would break down sort of the social fabric of the equality that he was trying to put into place. So, but those were his three goals, right? Those were the three aims that his government was trying to set up. So it's important when you're judging sort of a political system, a political regime, to first think about what are the objectives of that regime, right? And then you start to look at the laws and the systems that are put in place, and it makes a lot more sense, perhaps, as to why those laws may be put into place. Because it's not necessarily the case that, and we see this around the world, right, that all forms of government are trying to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish in the U.S. Constitution, in the United States, right? We have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, perhaps, as our three virtues that we're trying to uphold in our society. But it may not be that way in other countries, right? And some of the Arabic countries in the world, some of the Muslim countries in the world, their virtue is to make sure that their their societies living in in accord with the principles laid out in the Quran, right? For example, or other things like that. So you have to think about that when you're looking at systems of government, right? And that's where we're departing from sort of political science, getting into political theory, because we're asking these questions of, well, is there one particular form of government that we should be looking at, and one particular virtues of government that we should be looking at that is perhaps the best form of government? So that's a theme that we'll continue to touch on throughout the semester. So how did Lycurgus go about actually putting equality, military prowess, and austerity into place? Well, we talked about a lot of these already. We talked about them in the discussion, right? He had these laws. The first law, of course, that he put into place was this notion of a Senate, right? And he said this was important, and here again, this is another sort of important innovation, right? And sort of a predecessor of what we have in our own society. This notion of some sort of middle ground between tyranny and democracy, right? So tyranny being, a ruler who dictates, what the laws are going to be, what society is going to be. Democracy meaning sort of mob rule in a way, right? We're talking about the tyranny of the majority, it's sometimes called. So having this sort of Senate or council in the middle is a way to sort of moderate these two extremes of tyranny and, mob rule, right? So he sets that into place. He was told that he needed to put 30, right? But he ended up with 28, and there were several different interpretations as to why that particular thing happened, right? So another interesting question and a thing that he talked about was trying, at least this is what Plutarch said that he talked about, right, was this notion of trying to rid society of its deep-rooted diseases, right? And it was really interesting that the deep-rooted diseases that he talked about, well, one is poverty, right, which of course we say, yeah, sure, that is definitely a deep-rooted disease in a society. But the other one was even more interesting, which was wealth, right? And we often don't think about wealth necessarily as being a disease. I mean, perhaps that's because, free market economy and, the principles that our government is based on, but we generally think of wealth as being a good thing, right? But I guess the real question that we have to ask ourselves is, are wealth and poverty two sides of the same coin, right? In other words, if there were no wealth, would there be no poverty, right? Or because there is wealth, does that necessarily mean that there's going to be poverty? And that's a really interesting question. We'll talk about that when we talk about Marx a little bit, right? But something to think about, and it's an interesting observation, I thought. Okay, so how does he go about breaking down these two diseases of poverty and wealth, right? Well, the first thing that he does is that he gets rid of sort of all property, right? And he distributes property among all of the Spartans, right? He distributes it equally. Everybody gets this parcel of land that's big enough to support their families, right? So everybody has the same amount of land that they own in the Spartan society. Likewise, he gets rid of all sort of movable property that he calls it, but for us it'd be cars and our TVs and our furniture and all that, right? And sort of make sure everybody has the same amount of transferable property. So he gets rid of land, people having more land than the other. He makes it property equal. And then, of course, he institutes, and this is the thing that he said that made the wealthy the most angry, was this institution of these common messes, right, where people would actually get together and eat together in these eating companies, which, interestingly, if you think about fraternities and things like that, they actually have fraternities and sororities have a throwback to this notion of these people getting together and hanging out and eating together. These eating companies are very similar to the notion of fraternities and sororities. As a matter of fact, at a lot of the older universities in the United States, they actually still have eating companies, right? Or eating houses, I think they call them, where people get together and do these same things, these common messes that the Spartans did, that Lycurgus put into place, right? So Let's see, what else? I already talked about him sort of forbidding, the unnecessary and the superfluous arts, right? He wanted people to be focused on the practical aspects of life, rather than, painting a painting. He said, making this incredible Spartan cup, right? That they all drink out of. Another interesting thing about sort of the stuff that Lycurgus put into place was this notion that none of this stuff was written down, right? And I think that it was called the Great Rhetora. And so that had two things, right? So the Great Rhetora, in one sense, referred to the entire Spartan constitution that Lycurgus put into place. The other Great Rhetora was this notion that the oracle had provided that none of these laws actually be written down, because Lycurgus thought that rather than writing them down, they should be instilled in the hearts and minds of the Spartans, right? It'd be more powerful if it weren't written down, but it were rather in people's minds, in people's character. So that was the sense. And that's, of course, where the education comes into place, right? And that's why he puts all these, educational institutions in place regarding everything in Spartan society: birth, marriage, military service, etc., right? So some people would call it brainwashing, but he called it education. So that's why education, according to Lycurgus, was the noblest task of a statesman, right? It's because you're culturally indoctrinating your citizens into your way of life. That's why public education, important institution in America as well, or in any state. Yeah, I guess the last thing to say about Lycurgus is his last little flourish, right? How did he make sure that his laws were immortal? As he wanted his laws to be immortal and enduring and not to be changed, right? So how did he do it? He was pretty tricky, right? He said, well, I have this one more great matter that I want to consider, and I'm going to go to the oracle at Delphi, and I'm going to ask for her advice on this particular matter. But I want you guys to promise me that while I'm gone, you won't change any policies until I get back, right? And of course, he goes to the oracle at Delphi, and he gets a particular answer, and he does send that back to the Spartans. But that's not, he says he's still pursuing this other matter, right? And he speaks to the oracle at Delphi, and then whenever he gets his answer, he never goes back to Sparta, right? He actually kills himself. He starves himself to death, right? So he thought that was his last noble task, right? Was that if he essentially committed suicide and never went back to Sparta, they would have to honor his wishes and never change the laws that he put into place. So that's how Lycurgus made sure that his laws remained in place. That's an interesting question with the Constitution, whether that's a good thing or not, right? And we often have to amend our Constitution. We have had several amendments to our Constitution because times change, right? Our amendments have to be interpreted all the time because contexts change. But Lycurgus wasn't having any of that. Lycurgus wanted the law to essentially put into place, and he was willing to die to do it. So anyway, Lycurgus is an interesting example, right? He's sort of, I think one student put it well when she said that he was kind of a nudge. Obviously it's not democracy as we think about it, but he was kind of a nudge towards, popular sovereignty, right? Because the people did have the right to approve or disapprove the motions that were put forward by the council, right? Of course, they could be overridden by the council if they were perverting the laws or the policies that they were trying to put into place. But you have a constitutional government that is put into place. So right there, we're not dealing with a dictator, but we're dealing with rule of law, right? And that's essentially what a constitutional government is built upon, is that notion of rule of law. So anyway, that was Lycurgus. I think it's interesting. The stuff on the Spartan culture is fascinating, right? From a sociological perspective, a cultural perspective, but politically it's pretty interesting too, right? So this week we're going to be talking about the law of the jungle, right? And what is the law of the jungle, right? The law of the jungle is that the strong survive, right? And the strong have the right to rule over the weak. And we're going to look at two arguments from ancient Greece. One is going to be from Plato's Republic, voiced by his antagonist Thrasymachus. who sort of takes on this position of, they're talking about justice. Each one of the Platonic dialogues, so the Republic, the Crito, several other of the Platonic dialogues, they're all on these different kinds of virtues. And the virtue that's discussed in the Republic is justice, right? And what does justice mean? And Thrasymachus gives, this notion that justice is the strong taking from the weak, right? Because that's the law of the jungle, and that's the way the world works. Similarly, we're going to read excerpts from the Melian debate, right? Which was essentially the Athenians during the Peloponnesian War saying the exact same thing to this little island of Melos, which was actually an ally of Sparta, right? But the Athenians come in and they tell them, look, follow us or we'll kill you, right? And they have this great, interesting debate back between, the Melians trying to appeal to a sense of justice, right? And then the Athenians just say, look, justice is just the strong rule over the weak. So we're going to look at that this week. It's an interesting theory about justice, and we're going to try to decide whether it's true or not, right? So hope you